Exciting day here at Verified First because we are joined by Brian Fancher, Mitratech's Director of HRC Product Management and Compliance, to discuss the 5 steps you can take to prepare for the inevitable I-9 audit. This past year, we have spent our time having important conversations with some of America's most notable leaders in the HR and TA space. Through our HR at the Table Thought Leadership webinars, we've discussed the role HR and TA have in DE&I, brand, technology, talent, culture, leadership, ROI, the employee experience, and so much more. Our goal is to bring relevant and timely topics to our HR and TA community that supports you in your roles. All of these topics can be accessed through our HR at the Table resources page on our website at verifiedfirst.com. With each on-demand webinar you watch, you can earn 1 SHRM and 1 HRCI credit. You also have the option to receive credit for attending today's webinar too. If these discussions are important to you, be sure to check out our HR at the Table calendar to keep up to date on the topics that we're talking about. We've also worked hard to bring you a comprehensive deep dive of all the topics we've discussed through this series. So if you'd like to gather more insight, be sure to check out our blog page, also at verifiedfirst.com. Now, before we dive into today's discussion, I'd like to discuss some housekeeping items. As I mentioned, this webinar is available for 1 SHRM and 1 HRCI credit. For our live attendees looking to receive credit, be sure to stick around for our post-webinar survey. If you're listening to this on demand, check your email for instructions on how to redeem your credit. Also available to you is a downloadable PDF of the 5 steps to prepare for the inevitable I-9 audit. You can find this resource in the control panel, and it will additionally be included in the post-webinar email. Don't worry, this webinar is being recorded so you can use it as a resource, pass it along to your coworkers, or watch it whenever you want. We would love to answer as many of your questions as we can today, so make sure you utilize those chat and question functionalities. For some practice, I'd love to hear from the audience. Use the chat or question functionality and let us know if you are a returning HR at the Table fan. If not, let us know what you're looking forward to in today's discussion. Awesome. I personally am looking forward to hearing about each individual step to take to prepare for the I-9 audit. With that in mind, I'd like to kick us off by officially welcoming everybody to today's discussion. Please send a friendly hello and a warm welcome in the chat to our HR at the Table host, Ben Cornett, and Brian Fancher, Mitratech's Director of HRC Product Management and Compliance. Without further ado, take it away, Ben.
Thank you. So welcome everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. And Brian, welcome. Good to see you again.
Hey, thanks, Ben. Really happy to be here today.
Yeah, it's super exciting. I'm really excited for today's chat. And you know, obviously, when it comes to compliance around I-9, it's super important. So as a result of that, we're seeing really good registration from the audience. So obviously, a topic a lot of people care about. I'd love to kind of just kick in, maybe before we get going. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Brian, and what you do for Mitratech, and you know, how you landed in the HR technology space in some realm.
That's a great question. Right. Well, I can't say that when I grew up, I always envisioned myself being an I-9 expert. That wasn't perhaps the destiny I foresaw, but I'm here, and I really love ensuring that employers understand what it means compliant when it comes to employment eligibility and verification, which is what the whole I-9 is about. And I have been the Director of Product Management for the Mitratech platform that delivers I-9 automation and compliance. I've been doing this for about 11 years, so I'm like deep in the weeds, the wonkiness of I-9 processes and all the employment eligibility steps that go around that. So I've been with Mitratech now for going on 11 years, and I manage the product strategy for our human resources and compliance product portfolio. That's the HRC acronym in my title, and the I-9 platform is one of the flagship products in that portfolio. So we'll be talking about that today and getting prepared for that inevitable audit.
Yeah, awesome. It's super exciting. Now, I don't remember, but I think you're calling in East Coast. I want to say Boston. Is that right?
Actually, no, I'm West Coast.
Okay.
So I'm yeah, other end, but yeah, so I live in the San Francisco Bay Area and I grew up here. So, kind of a native to California, and there's, a couple of us. There's also a lot of people that end up here for a variety of reasons. So it's a good place to live.
Well, cool. So we're going to kick off, I think, get started with a question to our audience. And, we've got the, 11 years dealing with I-9. I think we got the subject matter experts can give us a lot of good tips here. So let me start off with our first poll question. I'll pop this up on the screen. So everyone in the audience, we're looking for your participation. This is going to help us make a great event. Let me go ahead and kick this poll off. So the question is, have you ever been through an ICE audit? And we'll probably talk a little bit about what an ICE audit is. It's a super simple question here. It's a yes or no. You should see that popping on your screen any moment here. I think my video might have froze. You still hear me, Brian?
Yeah, I can hear you loud and clear. I can see the quick poll on my screen.
Okay, awesome. Well, give everyone just a couple moments to weigh in and cast their vote. And we'll be watching that. Take a few moments. It looks like we've got 32% of the people still participated. So, okay, we just jumped to 70. We'll give it just another second. If you haven't voted, take a moment and vote. Have you ever been through an ICE audit? Brian, I know you've done this a long time. I'm going to stop the poll and then we'll share the results on the screen here.
Great.
What's the percentage of people of your gut says that they've been through an ICE audit before?
That's a great question. I'm going to say it's minority. I mean, maybe 25%. That might be on the high end. So what do we? Oh, look, yeah. All right. Well,
yeah.
It's much smaller than. Well, maybe I'm just too close to it. That I see it all the time. That I think it happens more frequently than it does. But that's an interesting statistic.
That's really, really interesting. I think, you look at this 4% to 96%, it's kind of maybe why people are starting to look, hey, I need to get ready for this audit because it might be coming.
If you've been through it, then you've learned something from that. There's probably some takeaways. And if you haven't, which the majority of you haven't, there's a lot of knowledge sharing we can dive into over the next 50 minutes or so. So I'm excited to get into the details. Yeah.
Well, awesome. So we're gonna just really quick, we're gonna play a short little 1-minute clip. Hopefully this plays for everyone. And if it's not playing, just tell us in the question section of the chat. This is kind of new for Verified First to play clip mid-webinar. So we'll see how this works. And then we'll come back and we're gonna talk about a little bit about what an ICE audit even is. So we'll give this little video clip here. You hit play.
Hi, I'm Sarah, and this is Christopher, the Verified First Product Guy. He's here to discuss Form I-9, a required document used to verify the identity and employment authorization of citizens and non-citizens hired for employment in the United States.
Did you know that just one Form I-9 error can receive up to a maximum fine of $2,332? Surprisingly, 76% of paper I-9s have at least one error, and the average number of errors per form is 4.1.
Is there a reason this one document has so many errors?
Well, Sarah, the Form I-9 is actually the most fined government form because of its high error rates. While it's only 2 pages, it comes with a 70-page instruction manual. So, as you can see, there's a lot to keep in mind when filling out the form. However, fully automating new hire I-9s through the Verified First integration with Mitratech reduces errors in a compliance track record of over 20 years. With this proven solution, users also benefit from an efficient, streamlined hiring process, built-in compliance tools, expert audit support, fully encrypted cloud-based solution that ensures data protection, and one of the finest client care teams.
Sounds easy enough. To schedule a demo, click. Hi, I'm.
So we're going to skip through a scheduled demo. Obviously, we're going to go through a little bit about that today, Brian. Really kind of fun. Did that play okay on your end?
Yeah, it played great. Loud and clear.
No, awesome. Well, so, we talked a little bit about in that video, just kind of, there's real issues connected to an audit. So, I want to spend, obviously most of our time today kind of digging into those issues and how to prepare for those, right? So maybe we kick off with, you can tell us, what an ICE audit is. Let's start there. There might be a lot of people that might not know, being that 96% of people haven't been through it, right?
Right, exactly. Maybe that was right, exactly. Well, let's go into it. So ICE is an acronym. We should probably start there. That's an agency within the Department of Homeland Security that's in charge of enforcing U.S. immigration law. And so that stands for Immigration Customs Enforcement. So when we say an ICE audit, what we mean is that there's a representative from ICE who is auditing an employer's I-9s. And this is a very formal process that the federal government practices as a way to ensure that employers are fulfilling their responsibility to verify the identity and employment authorization of all individuals working in the United States for pay who were hired after November 6th, 1986. So an ICE audit is this process that we'll get into some of the details where, again, the government agent would come and request your I-9s and some other information. We'll go into what that looks like. And the outcome of that, why it matters, is ICE has the authority not only to subpoena and request I-9s, but also, depending upon how well the employers have done completing them, can issue fines when the I-9 wasn't completed altogether or wasn't completed correctly. So that's really where it matters, is that this is, as mentioned in the video, one of the most widely fined U.S. federal government forms. And we can go into some of the reasons why in a bit. So that's what an ICE audit is. One thing to probably just as a quick aside is say what an ICE audit isn't. And that is, there are other types of audits that the federal or state agencies may perform on I-9s that are handled by different agencies. So there's a Department of Justice audit that gets interested in I-9s. Department of Labor can be interested in may request I-9s. Also, you may be familiar with E-Verify, which is an additional step in the employment eligibility process. E-Verify has an auditing function. The important thing to note, though, is that those agencies don't have the same breadth and scope of subpoena power to request your assets. And with the exception of the Department of Justice, typically there are no fines involved in the outcomes of those other audits by those other agencies. You'll probably get a warning, maybe something else. So when we talk about the ICE audit, what's really meaningful behind it is that potentiality of being fined, and then coincide that with the high error rates that typically we see for employers who aren't fully invested in making sure they have a compliance process. If you're not really buying into the importance of what it means to be in compliance for completing I-9s, there's a really good chance your I-9s could have those errors that ICE may invoke a fine for. So that's it in a nutshell. Yeah.
Yeah, I really like the idea we kind of explained what it's not, and hopefully that helps everyone in the audience really get a clear picture of what we're talking about today. I know we're going to jump into a process here, but any initial stats or numbers you want to share around ICE audits as we get going, or are we going to talk about that later?
Yeah, we have a slide where we'll go through some of the numbers. I think what is not reflected on that slide that's important is that, during the pandemic, COVID-19 impacted just about everything. And the frequency and rate at which we saw ICE audits occur, that went down. There was quite a few, definitely a lull period that we saw over the past 16, 18 months during this time. And I think that was just the government being sympathetic that, hey, let's not impose a burden on employers in light of everything else that was going on in the pandemic. Now, that being said, recently, within the last 6 to 8 weeks, we have started to see more ICE audits occur through our customer base, and we're starting to support them again. So while there was a lull, there definitely is, we're back on track, I would say, to some of the numbers that we'll show you later on in the deck on what that looks like. And I think the other thing as we go through this process and plan for how to prepare is I'll make mention of some key takeaways, some things that really you can turn into an action item if you're interested in making a commitment to being prepared for the audit, what we think you can do in that sense, and we'll call those out as we go through these steps. Yep.
Perfect. Well, Brian, that's a good little transition, to look about the inspection process. And Just reminding everyone, there is a questions section in GoToWebinar. Feel free to ask your questions. And Letitia asked a question from San Diego. Letitia, welcome, and thanks for the question. I think it's more logistical than anything. It's like, are we supposed to see more than just what an ICE audit? So the answer is yes, we'll go through them. And Brian's going to kind of walk us through the audience, what the process looks like when it comes to Form 99 inspection. But Letitia, thanks for your question. Keep them coming.
Good question. Yeah, I see a couple of the hellos too, so thanks for that in chat. Yeah, so what you're looking at here is the Form I-9 inspection process, and this is a process that's been defined by ICE, by Immigration's Custom Enforcement Agency. So we're not going to go through all of the little tiles here and the possible outcomes. The key thing to note here is that all ICE audits start with a notice of inspection, or what we refer to as the NOI. I think in the pack of materials that we'll provide to you that are available to you through this webinar will be a sample NOI, so you actually can look at it and see what it looks like. And this NOI has been standardized over the last 4 to 5 years. We've seen all ICE agents who are issuing NOIs, they're using the same templated letters. That's nice. It used to be before that NOIs could look different from different offices. But anyway, so I want to call out that notice of inspection, and that's going to kick off the process. And the key thing about the notice of inspection is it's going to define all of the requirements that the employer has to meet in order to respond to that inspection and that audit. Now, obviously, after the NOI is issued, there's a period of time. We'll go into some of the details and what the employer must do and when. And that first deliverable is going to be the employer is going to surrender their Form I-9s and some other supporting materials. And then ICE is going to go take their time and review those. And I guess the key thing to call out is at the end of the process, what we really wanted to avoid is that notice of intent to fine. That's the big orange box at the bottom. So there's a potential where during the inspection process, ICE can come back and say, hey, we found an error or errors that warrant us issuing a fine, and we are putting you on notice that that fine is coming. And that's the worst case outcome here. There are other outcomes that can happen that are far less painful than obviously getting a fine assessed as a result of the audit. ICE can issue warnings where ICE isn't totally cold-blooded, right? I mean, they understand that this process is complicated enough that there's a chance that most employers have at least one error, maybe a few errors. It's where the error rate increases or the lack of seriousness that ICE assumes based upon error rate where that fine can be assessed. So you can get off with a warning, it's a slap on the wrist and don't do it again. That's still a happy day because there's no fine. Obviously the fine itself is the worst case scenario. So, if there are questions about this process, we can certainly save some time towards the end of the discussion to kind of go into some of the other paths, if you will. If there were some curious attendees who want to know more, have a specific question about these outcomes, we can certainly come back to this and spend some more time on it. But here's the process. It's a very transparent process. ICE publishes this on their website, which is where we got this material. Although ours looks nicer because their website's a little dated. That's okay. They're not in the business of making pretty slides, so they're in the business of enforcing regulatory compliance.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I do see a couple of questions coming in, which Alan and Carol, thanks for your questions. I think I'll save those for the end because they're probably going to be a spark for our wrap-up conversation. As we go through, we're thinking a little bit about some of the stats, right? We talked a little bit about at the very beginning. Maybe walk us through what this means and what it means for our audience, maybe.
Sure, right. So this is getting into like why it matters, okay? So clearly, right at the headline here is that, and again, these statistics are pre-COVID, although we're starting to see a resurgence of ICE audits again over the last 6 weeks. So pre-COVID, ICE had really ramped up the number of audits that were being performed year over year. It was a 375% increase. That was largely due to, in many ways, the administration at the time was very focused on ICE audits, and they had done an additional round of investment. Now, when you think about that, though, it's important to note that every administration since Bush 2 has really increased the number of audits. So if you saw the trend line, you would see this, pretty steep bell curve going up as these administration over administration definitely have seen more audits over time. In fact, The key takeaway here is that during the past 2 years prior to COVID, we had seen almost 7,000 notices of inspection being issued by ICE over about an 18-month period. And if you look at the period before that, there was about 1,600 notices of inspection over the previous period of equivalent length. So that's a tripling of the number of audits that were issued. So the frequency at which audits are occurring is definitely on the rise. And again, we mentioned that it's the most widely fined federal form. In 2019 alone, as far as we know, this number could change because it's not always public in terms of the number of fines, but we've seen and heard in the news that there's been at least $14 million in fines assessed to an employer as a result of that orange box event that happens at the end of the process, right, where you get that notice of fine. I think there's a couple other things to call out on this slide deck. The key thing at the bottom is that the maximum fine that an employer can face per I-9 found in error is $2,300. Now that's very high, and you have to do a lot wrong to get to that end of the range. The low end, meaning the minimum fine that you would face per I-9 found in error, is roughly about $230. Now, most of the time you're going to be somewhere in that range. It's a pretty big range, right? I mean, that's a 10x range in terms of where you can land. But either way, the numbers really add up very quickly in terms of the potential risk that you might be facing. Obviously, this formula is driven by the number of hires that you perform year over year, because those are the number of new I-9s that you're creating. Really quick, I'll mention this is one of the things that we'll talk about a little bit later. But when we talk about the ICE process and what I-9s are audited, the ICE is limited. ICE can't just audit every I-9. They can only audit I-9s for active employees, meaning employees who still work for you, that were hired after November 6, 1986, or employees who have left the company, and there's a little formula that determines for those departures whether or not you have to keep their I-9. So you have to keep an I-9 for everyone, again, all active employees, and then all inactive employees, employees who've left the organization, either 3 years after that employee's hire date, or 1 year after date of termination. So it's the 3-year, 1-year rule. So when we talk about the scope of risk, when you think about it, it would be all of your active employees plus all of the I-9s that are still subject to retention based upon that 3-year, 1-year rule. The 3-year, 1-year rule can be a little complicated. Don't worry about it right now. We'll have some materials that cover that a little bit more in more detail if that confused you. But that is an important part of this story. It's like, well, it's really two things. Is how likely is it that I'm going to be audited? And then if I am, what's the risk that I face? And certainly, when we talk about 7,000 notices of inspection being issued over a little less than 2 years, that's a big number. Clearly, most of the folks in this call haven't experienced an I-9 audit. So the chances are more likely than not that you won't get audited every year, but over time, we're seeing, especially across our client base, that likelihood of being audited is certainly on the rise. And something to think about in this when you're making that commitment to being compliant and what that means. Yeah.
It's really interesting. I think we probably answered this question. You mentioned multiple times 1986 is the magic year, right?
Yeah.
So Cheryl submitted a question. I think I know the answer to it, but I'll let the expert answer because the question from Cheryl, and thanks for the question, Cheryl, is employees hired prior to 1986, do they need it completed after the fact?
No.
Do you need no, right?
No, right? That's right. Yeah, you don't need an I-9. If an employee has started their employment prior to November 6, 1986, you're off the hook. So that does happen. But that's definitely a little bit of peace of mind there. So yeah.
I know that's a little bit rare in our world, but good for you, Cheryl.
Yeah.
You haven't been hired since 1986.
That's right.
Well, let's maybe jump to another poll question. I know we're still getting questions coming in here. And I'll pop this up on the screen here. So the question is, how confident are you that your I-9s would be ready for an ICE audit tomorrow? And really kind of interesting question. We'll see what we get from the audience, and hopefully that pops up on your screen here. It freezes a little bit on my end, so there we go. Take a moment, cast your vote. We'll give it a few seconds. I think we talked a little bit about this, Brian, a couple of weeks ago. It's like sometimes employers, they might consider themselves overconfident, and I think I could see myself in that role at one point is, I'm confident that we're good, we're doing everything right, but the reality and what I think are two different things sometimes. So we'll see what the audit does here. So we'll get up to 75%. We got a few more votes coming in. Take a moment, cast your vote. And let me just close this poll and I'll share the results here with you.
Interesting numbers.
Screen there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we got the big ones, everyone's confident, kind of that overconfident story sometimes.
That the headline here is 50% of the audience is confident or very confident. That's great. And I think to your point, Ben, there's certainly a lot of focus on I-9 enforcement and compliance over the years. I mean, again, I'm very close to the subject, so that could be a little bit of a little bias there. But I would say over time, employers are becoming more aware of the risk and the requirements around it. And that's due to a lot of different factors. The key thing for us when we think about audit readiness, it really largely comes down to two things. Is one, are you still completing the Form I-9 on paper? And if you're not, what the quality of the electronic I-9 solution that they're using needs to be assessed. And it really comes down to the fact that according to our analytics, we've reviewed millions of paper I-9s, and not quite as many, but hundreds of thousands of I-9s produced in what we would consider an inferior electronic solution. And in the video, you might have heard, it may have stuck out at you, that there's an error rate of 76% on forms. And that's a number that we provided to Verified First, because that's according to our data. And the sample size here is huge, right? So if you complete your Form I-9 on paper, that error rate is at 76%. And that's what's astonishing, is that a lot of employers that we speak to don't believe that that number applies to them. We didn't ask that question exactly here in this poll, but what error rate do you think you have? And when we pose that question, a lot of employers might say, 5–10%. And the fact is that the Form I-9 process is really complicated. And the error rate is really high. In fact, if you were to ask me, I would tell you that the Form I-9 process is broken. A process that results in a 76% failure rate, even for those employers that are trying to get it right, is a broken process. And that's really in the paper universe, because that's where it really gets challenging, is there's just so many ways you can get the I-9 wrong. And again, that's resulting in that higher error rate. So, we are very proud of our track record. We've gone through hundreds of ICE audits at Mitratech, and not one I-9 created in our platform has been fined. And that's really an exciting track record we're really proud of. And we're not going to claim that we're the only solution that can deliver that type of compliance. But we are aware that there are many electronic solutions that are really inferior. In fact, there's a great story around a company that built an electronic solution in-house. So they decided, hey, this I-9, it's not that complicated. We understand it. They built an I-9 solution in-house, and they built it, and it wasn't well designed. They didn't have an expert to guide them, and the solution that they built actually was missing some forms on the field. They got audited, and ICE said, hey, it is as if you didn't complete the form itself because of this flaw in your electronic solution. So that's the worst case scenario, is that there are potentially some solutions out there where every I-9 you're creating based on a bad design isn't meeting the requirements. Of course, there are a lot of other, a lot of good solutions and a lot of great solutions, including ours out there to help reduce that error rate. So that's one thing to think about in this, for a very complex process around I-9 compliance, is just what's the error rate and how do I get ahead of it?
Yeah, and I think it's thanks for sharing the example. I know we talked a little bit about that, the idea of you can build it. Some companies, and we're not going to say the name of the company, but this was a very large, multinational known brand that tried to build it on their own, right? And unfortunately failed. So it happens to the best of the best. So maybe with that, a question that I've seen in the audience here is, does Form I-9 matter for every size of employer? From the small guys to the big guys, because obviously the bigger you are, the bigger the fine. Any comments there?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, for larger employers that have larger workforces, and particularly those that have higher turnover rates, this is a simple math problem. The more I-9s you create every year, if you have that higher, if you're on paper and you have an error rate of 76%, that number, that potential fine really gets astronomically large rather quickly. But it still matters for smaller employers, obviously not as much. If you hire a few people a year and it turns out your error rate is 76%, you might only be facing a few $1,000 fine as a result of an audit, whereas the larger employers with tens of thousands of hires per year could be facing a multi-million-dollar fine. As we noted in 2019, that fineable, the publicly disclosed fine amount of $14 million is pretty high.
Yeah. But no one's exempt, right? Essentially, that's what I just heard. No one's exempt from good time.
Yeah, no one's exempt. One thing we should mention, maybe right before we get into how to prepare, is we often get the question, so this may have come up, Ben, already in the list of questions, is, well, who does ICE target? I mean, do they have like a profile of the type of employer that's more likely to get audited than someone else? And in general, ICE says no, there is no industry or verticals that we target more than others. And that might be true. I don't have a reason to think why they wouldn't be truthful about that. But what we see is that obviously the larger the employer in terms of your footprint, the more locations you have in the United States, or the larger you are in general, then just there's more likely chance that you're going to get picked. Your ticket's going to be the lottery winner that day when ICE issues the notice of inspection. And in the past, I would say 10 years ago, we did see trends around manufacturing, around energy and transportation. And these were seen as, as verticals that might be more subject to risk in terms of a terrorist attack. Because again, out of 9/11, there was some focus around that to like, hey, maybe we should do some additional checks in those types of businesses. But we're not seeing that anymore.
Yeah. That's really interesting you mentioned that. So Stuart submitted a question a little bit earlier and kind of related to the idea of the industries maybe that had a little upticks. And it's like, his question, thanks Stuart for your question, is there a typical profile of companies you see being audited? Is there like the magic window, I guess, maybe is what Stuart's looking for, but any comments there, Brian?
Not that I can see. I mean, we've poured over the data because we'd love to gain some insights that would help the public prepare and be aware of where the likelihoods may lie depending on the type of business you're in. So unfortunately, I don't think there's any conclusions we can draw lately. And again, ICE is saying, hey, we'll audit anybody and there's no preference. The one thing I will say though is that an ICE audit can be, and I'll use the term arbitrary in the sense that there's a quota out there that that ICE has to meet every year, where they are agreeing to performing a certain number of audits per year. At least that's how we believe it works. And that is going to get, again, that's just going to be ICE conducting their random audits across the U.S. employment ecosystem, which is a big one. But there's also another triggering event, which is there's a whistleblower line where an employee who believes that the employer may be hiring folks that aren't authorized to work, or maybe there's something in the I-9 process that the employee felt was incorrect. Maybe lots of reasons why someone might call ICE and say, hey, I think this employer should be audited, and that can trigger an event as well. Now, ICE doesn't disclose those types of whistleblower events, I'll call them. So it's hard to know the data around that, how frequent that is, but that is certainly a way that an ICE audit can get kicked off.
Yeah. Well, let's dig in a little bit to the 5 steps to prepare, because I know our time is like, it's disappearing.
I know, right? It goes real fast.
It's really good. So maybe Brian, walk us through a little bit, why preparation is so important.
Yeah, so I think, when we talk about, I think we have a slide we can go to here in a bit, Ben, that will actually outline the 5 steps, and we can bring that up in a minute. Here we go. So there's 5 steps to prepare, and let me just go over them real quick. First is, communication across your organization. And so we'll go into what that means. We're really talking about a communication strategy. Next is we want to make sure that at the time that an ICE audit occurs, that you have the right legal resources to bring to bear to respond to that audit. So we'll talk about what that looks like. The third thing, and this is where the bulk of the work is okay, now you've got to respond to this subpoena that's asking for all these materials. And how do you get ready to respond to the ICE audit and deliver those assets to ICE? Third, and this is important, obviously, that it pertains to those folks that use the tracker platform, which is a Mitratech product, how we would support you. But also, if you're not using Tracker and you're using another electronic platform, you really need to understand how your electronic provider is going to support you. That's really important. This step obviously doesn't apply if you're still using paper. And then last, it's like, well, how can you prepare? Maybe this should be the first point we bring up, but how can you prepare in advance of this audit in terms of getting your I-9s clean and ready? So we talked about that 76% error rate. Well, there's something you can do about that to get that number down. So we'll come back to that one last. There's a lot of questions that come up about that one. And I think we can go right into the communication. And when I think about this, this is really about that first step of preparedness, is having a communication strategy. And when we talk about the strategy, there's really kind of three pillars to it. One is we need to stress across the organization the importance of what it means to be ICE audited and the potential outcomes, which is this fine that could happen if we don't have our house in order. So you got to get alignment and buy-in from your leadership and also from the stakeholders who would be delivering a response to ICE if it happens. So stress the importance of why this matters. We're trying to convey that with obviously the risks of the fines and the likelihood of it occurring, and that's just important to convey across the board. The second is you want to have a policy, that communication tool, where you can define what it is that you do as an organization for I-9 and E-Verify. There's a lot of stuff out there that's available on the web. At Mitratech, we actually have a sample policy. I'm not sure if it's in our set of assets to deliver. Shay, maybe I'll work with our team. Maybe we can get that out to you guys. But there's a sample policy that you have a company that says, hey, we take I-9 seriously. We follow the rules. And there's some details in there that you would want to define around how your organization, your business processes within the organization deliver on I-9 compliance. So it's important to have that particular asset because it goes to show your seriousness of taking how serious you take compliance, which is a factor that ICE can consider when determining whether or not you get the slap on the wrist or the fine. Seriousness is actually a mitigating factor that ICE takes into consideration. So communicating the importance, having a policy, this goes towards the seriousness. And then the third piece of the communication plan and strategy is to make sure that you have like an audit playbook that describes who's going to get communicated to first, and how do we make sure that the chain of command is aware that an ICE audit is taking place, so those roles and responsibilities are defined so that you can respond. So what that could look like is, obviously whoever's receiving the NOI, that's actually going to be a physical delivery, typically, of a notice of inspection. The ICE auditor will deliver the notice in paper, usually on premise, and whoever receives that notice will have to sign acknowledging receipt. Sometimes it'll be sent via certified mail. In rare circumstances, they'll come to your door and say, hey, I'm going to email it to you. Who should I email it to? But you'll get that physical delivery. But once that NOI is delivered, what's really important is that you have 72 hours to respond. So that's one of the key takeaways here. And I've mentioned that before, is a 72-hour response. So in order to execute successfully all that you're going to have to do in 72 hours, you have to be prepared. We've seen time and time again, usually people get interested in buying our product after the fact, like, hey, we got audited and we weren't ready, and maybe we got a warning, maybe we got a fine. We're taking it serious now. And that's going to happen, continue to happen. But if you're on the call here, like, how can you prepare yourself for success? Starts with taking the importance of what it means to be ready, having a policy in place that defines how you practice your I-9 governance, if you will, and then just in a case of emergency, you have an audit playbook at the ready, so you know the roles and responsibility of who's gonna execute on delivering that.
So a question came up, I think it's kind of related to the communication piece here, Brian. Is this person, Danielle, thanks for your question, says office is outside of her state, they don't have an HR rep.
Yeah.
So question is, can I view photocopies of their ID and sign the form if I'm not on the site? Any Maybe that's
Yeah,
because
so
policy is too. It's a little bit fuzzy right there, probably.
yeah, right. So that you're getting into the I-9 process itself. Like, how do I complete the I-9 process in a compliant way, which is a little out of scope of this question, but hey, let me answer it. So the answer today is yes, there is a COVID policy exception that allows documents to be inspected remotely. Now that is an exception to a very clear rule that says employers must inspect documents in person in the presence of the employee. So when you're completing the I-9, that's the standard. USCIS and ICE have said, hey, we're going to allow employers temporarily to inspect documents remotely in light of the pandemic. But note that today that temporary policy will end. And when it ends, there's an agreement the employer makes to do a deferred physical inspection. So you're kind of stuck still, right? Because if you're inspecting documents remotely because you don't have an on-site HR, unless the policy changes, once that temporary deferred, or once that temporary virtual inspection policy ends, you're going to actually need to go and physically inspect the document. Now that can be someone else, it doesn't have to be you. But this is a great question. We have a blog post about this. Maybe we can share that with you that goes into more details. I don't want to chew up too much time on that, but good question. It is a complicated process. But that was the short answer, which actually wasn't that short.
Hopefully that helps, Danielle.
Yeah.
Thanks for your question again. So going on, obviously we're looking at legal counsel and support and, drafting some defining record access here. Any like pro tips? I know we have a couple poll questions we probably want to get to. I just looking at our time,
sure.
Worried about we're going to run out.
The key thing here is just make sure that you have, if your organization can support having legal representation, that could be a huge help. Knowing, someone who's been through the process can be particularly helpful in guiding you and making sure that you avoid any common mistakes and that you have, a rapport with the ICE officer that's established through attorney-client privilege and all that kind of stuff. So it's better to have an attorney than not. That's not always possible. Sometimes in-house legal counsel can handle this. Obviously, if you have an I-9 expert, you might be able to. You could be fine without a legal representative, but in general, our best practice is always make sure you have legal counsel if you can. So I think moving on to the third, I'll get to some pro tips in a bit. I didn't just blow right through that. And the third point here on defining your process for record access, this is critical because in addition to the Form I-9 that you must surrender, which is going to be a part of that subpoena that's in the notice of inspection, ICE is also going to ask for payroll records, tax records, articles of incorporation. They really have a lot of leeway in terms of what they can ask for. But what they are getting at, what ICE is trying to establish, is documents that corroborate who you hired and to make sure that there's an I-9 for them, right? So in order to so that's the payroll record. So they're going to look at who you paid, and then they're going to make sure that there's an I-9. It's one of the first things that they'll do. So in addition to having I-9s at the ready to deliver within 72 hours, you also have to have these other assets at the ready. So you want to make sure, and in the best practices guide that we'll distribute to you today, we'll describe the common assets that ICE will ask for, and you just want to make sure, again, part of roles and responsibilities, that you have somebody who can easily get to this information and deliver it quickly within that 72-hour period.
Yeah, time is essence for sure. So let's following up with that access. I think this is a good poll question. We'll launch to the audience here. Is off the top of your head, we'll let this pop up on your screen here. Should coming up any moment now. It says off the top of your head, do you know who your audit response team consists of? And be interesting to see what the audience says. Where we have 96% of the audience has never been through an ICE audit. My gut tells me that there's probably not a connection there.
Yeah.
See. So take a moment for our audience. Again, just reminding everyone, we do have questions at the end coming up, and be sure to post your questions. We got a lot there. So you guys have probably asked this question in other webinars, Brian. What's your split usually look like? Is it 40-50, 60-50? What's it look like?
Oh, for this question, yeah, it's similar to the previous question. So, the common driver for readiness is having been through an audit. Although often, so I would say my guess here is this is going to be close to the previous percentage we saw. Hopefully I'm wrong.
Yeah. And we'll give it just another second, take a moment and vote if you haven't voted yet. We'll close the poll here in just a second. There we go. Let's share the results here. So 58% yes and 42% not yet. I think that's
I was
really
way
interesting.
wrong. That's great.
Yeah,
That's
and that's
good.
what I like about live webinars is because we can get like live results, right, and get a good idea.
I'm learning something. I think that's great.
Yeah.
Good question. Good to hear. For those that you don't have a process in place, we'll help you, get some materials so you can set that up internally and get buy-in from your leadership on this. Yeah.
Yeah, good. I'm glad that it looks like at least most of our audience is connected to who's on my team. You mentioned earlier, Brian, a playbook, an audit playbook. Yep. Is that something you guys have? I know you have a policy. Is that another resource you guys might have?
Yeah, I think that would probably fall under your policy. I'll have to check. I think that is something we have. We can certainly provide a template that will help, and then obviously each individual organization is going to need to define that based upon your business processes and org structure. And there's just going to be a lot of fill in the blanks because there's going to be some questions that we can't answer. But yeah, we'll be happy to share that with you guys.
Cool.
We have an audit playbook, which actually goes to the fourth pillar here. We have an audit playbook that has been fine-tuned over the years. So if you were to be supported by Tracker I, by the Mitratech organization, we've handled hundreds of audits. We know exactly, we know all the tricks of the trade. And typically the way this would work is that if you were to be audited and Tracker or Mitratech were to be your I-9 electronic I-9 provider, we're gonna basically be with you all throughout the entire process. So we'll review the notice of inspection with your audit response team lead, whether that's legal, if you have legal representation, or maybe it's not. We'll define the scope of the audit. We'll make sure that we get the I-9s out of the Tracker system to you. Usually we can deliver that within a couple of hours. We're going to provide you with a lot of other supporting material that describes the Tracker I-9 platform, which is a requirement when you use an electronic platform. You'll see this in the notice of inspection cover letter that we're going to provide to you as part of the sample set, is that there's a paragraph in the notice of inspection that says, if you use an electronic platform, you have to provide us this, and this. So it's what really ICE wants is a description of the platform. What technology is it using? Is it meeting all the regulatory requirements? Because there are specific regulations that dictate what an electronic solution must deliver and some of the requirements around that. So we've got that all bundled up and well understood. In the Mitratech Tracker world, we're going to be able to support you. If you're not using Mitratech and Tracker and you're using another provider, you definitely want to be asking these questions of your provider so that you understand what it is that they're going to be able to do in the event of a notice coming to your door and how they'll support you. That's really important. Some vendors, they'll leave it up to you in terms of get the I-9s out of the system yourself, and sometimes it could look different. So yeah.
Well, I know we're going to talk about the last one, the scrub and cleanse kind of step in the process, but popping up another poll questions for our audience before we talk about that is, how often do you purge I-9s from your repository? Take just a moment and let us know how often you purge your I-9s. Is there a right answer here, Brian? I mean, I don't want to
I don't want to influence
our audience
votes.
before we answer the question, but
yes, I think there's a best practice for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. We'll give everyone else just a little moment here to vote. As people are voting, maybe I can ask a question.
Sure.
So we can kind of start that process, I think, a little bit. One of the question is, and this is from Carol. Carol, thanks for your question. Is there a way to recapture lost I-9s? For example, older records were lost, or do they need to be completely redone?
Yeah, great question. So they need to be redone is generally the answer I would give. It may depend upon the circumstances. And I throw out the caveat, I'm not an attorney, so I'm not practicing law when I give any advice here. But generally, you need to have an I-9 for every active employee or an employee that qualifies for the retention requirements, which is what this purge question is getting at. So yeah, you would, in general, what you would do is you would create a new I-9, and then you would add a note to that I-9 saying, hey, we created an I-9 at some other time in the past, and you could describe that with some detail. That's helpful, so that you're calling out that the I-9 was created because you discovered that the previous I-9 was lost. So that goes to show how serious you're taking the process and that you're trying to correct the issue of losing the previously completed I-9. So, oh, but we have I see the poll results up here. So pretty evenly spread there, not daily. That's a lot to do it daily, but good for you. I think the best practice here is you definitely want to be looking at those I-9s that can be purged and doing it at least on a quarterly basis. The key thing here is this is that 3-year, 1-year rule. So what we're talking about is for those employees who have left the organization, you do not need to keep their I-9 forever. You can purge the I-9 is the verb we typically use, either 3 years after the employee's date of hire or 1 year after date of termination, whichever is later. So the way to think about that is if Ben hired me tomorrow and I quit the same day, he's got to keep that I-9 for 3 years after date of hire. But if I work for Ben for 10 years and I am leaving, well, now you just need to keep the I-9 for 1 year after I've left. But what the key thing here is to purge those I-9s. You want to get rid of them. There may be legal requirements for why you might want to, or reason for why you might want to retain them outside of retaining it to meet the regulatory I-9 requirements, because there are some collective bargaining agreements that may require you to keep your I-9. So just, I'm not advising you to just haphazardly, purge all your I-9s without taking into consideration the reason why you might want to keep them longer than the I-9 regulations require. But definitely you want to purge these I-9s when you can, because that's one way to ensure that you're not handing over I-9s to ICE that they could audit that could become a finable offense, right? So when we talk about defining the scope of the audit and making sure that you're only giving the I-9s that ICE is asking for, that's really important. And you don't want to hand over I-9s that could be purged. So that's part of that cleansing and scrubbing process here in this 5th pillar of readiness. Is purge your I-9s, as often as you can, as reasonably as you can, making sure to keep it if you have a valid reason to do so outside of the retention requirements. That's one step. And the second step is that, there is a process, an internal audit process that's worth considering. And this is where, as an organization, you can do it yourself or you can hire someone to help you. Let's take a small sample size of those I-9s that we have today that we're retaining, right? Maybe just start with 5 or 10, or I don't know, you could do a percentage. I'm gonna take 1% of my I-9s and I'm gonna check them for errors. And that would at least give you a sense of, how well you're performing. Remember we asked, how confident are you that your I-9s are in good shape? Well, one way to pressure test your confidence is actually to do a spot check audit. And if you do find out, oh my gosh, these are in worse case than I thought, well, that would be a reason to go and actually try and clean them up. There is a way you can go back and retroactively make corrections to I-9s and repair their errors. And in general, most of the time, almost all the time, but there's always some exception because this is a complicated process, ICE will honor those corrections and say, hey, you've done it. ICE loves it when you audit your own I-9s, find a mistake and correct it. They think that's awesome because you're showing and showcasing how serious that you take this, right? So if you have that capacity, that's very hard to do. I understand. I'm not sympathetic to what HR departments have on their plate already. I talk to you folks all the time. But if you do have capacity or a budget where you can just maybe as a side skunk work project, just get a couple I-9s audited, it can go a long way to giving you a sense of the health of your I-9s.
Yeah, it's really good. It's kind of, we'll switch over to pro tips here. It's kind of related to Emily's question. And so her questions, when conducting internal I-9 audit, they found a lot of the I-9s have the other last names used box empty and the prepare box unchecked. And her question is, how important is it to track down the employees and have them input the NA and check the box for no preparer, including date initials, or should they just attach a memo? Any best practice there for Emily?
This is where it gets tough, right? Because the best practice is, yes, you want to track down the employee and have them make those corrections themselves, because that's in compliance with rule that says only the employee will make corrections to section 1 or make changes to section 1. So the use cases you've described are errors in section 1. They're innocent mistakes often, right? It's not like the employee was willfully ignoring the rules. He just didn't know that all fields on section 1 have to have an NA in them if they don't apply. Anyway. So the best practice is, yes, to ask the employee to make those corrections. If that's not possible because they don't work for you, or it's just not reasonable because doing so just can't be done, at a minimum, you want to put a note on the I-9 saying, hey, we noticed these 2 mistakes. can't fix them for this reason. And you're acknowledging your own shortcomings, because again, there will be some. If you're on paper, I guarantee you'll find this kind of stuff with some frequency. So that's my answer. I mean, everything is a case-by-case basis in some ways. So there might be an exception to that where you would want to make sure you get the employee to make a correction, such as if they didn't sign the form or they didn't complete their employee attestation indicating if they were a citizen or non-citizen. Some of those other attributes of the I-9 where that data is missing, that is viewed as a more egregious error by ICE. So that's an important thing to distinguish. And there's not enough time to go through all the details of which are the worst errors versus the not so bad errors, but there is a matrix of errors in terms of whether they're considered substantive, which is the egregious errors, or technical, which is still an error that can result in a fine, but something that ICE is more likely to give you that slap on the wrist for if you have those.
Yeah. I know. It's really, some of these questions, Brian, you can say, it's a really good question.
Yeah.
We're going to share contact information. We can certainly follow up. So if you can't answer the question, please say, I'll follow up with you later. Is that fair?
Sure. Yeah, let's do it.
I'm just going to go through. We got a lot of questions in. So for our audience, again, kind of last 4 or 5 minutes here, if you have questions, you want to ask Brian, and if we can't answer them on the webinar today, we'll follow up with some answers for you. So this one's from Daniele and related to non-US citizens. So in my mind, I'm not clear if this is a 99 question or an E-Verify question. The question is, for employees that are not US citizens, do they have to review their ID when their ID expires? Is that a 99 related issue, or is that more?
Yeah, that's 99. Yeah. Okay. So the answer is it depends. But I think I can take this and answer this on the webinar. It's a good question. So the way I'm interpreting the question is, I've hired someone who's not a US citizen, and they've presented a document that evidences their identity and employment authorization, and now that document is going to expire. So what do I need to do about it? And the answer is, as I alluded to at the top, is it depends. It depends upon the non-citizen status, because there are a couple, and it depends upon the document that's provided. Okay. So in general, there are 2 types of documents for non-citizens. There's a document that evidences permanent employment authorization. So you have non-citizens who have permanent employment authorization in the United States, such as a green card holder. You're not a citizen, you can't vote, but you're a green card holder, which means you can live and reside in the United States permanently. And even if your green card expired, which is a colloquial term, green card isn't really the official form document title. It's called a permanent resident card or an I-551, but commonly referred to as a green card. When the green card expires, you don't need to look at a new document or inspect a new document, because when their green card expires, their work authorization doesn't expire. It's just like your US passport. If you're a citizen, if your passport expires, your citizenship doesn't expire, it's just your passport expired. You got to go get a new passport to travel. So that is an example of a document that permanently authorizes work authorization. However, most foreign nationals do have documents that have temporary work authorization. So an example of that is an EAD card or Form I-765. That document confers employment eligibility for a defined set of time, usually 2, 3, 4 years, it depends. And for those documents, you absolutely must re-verify that employee's work authorization on or before that document expiration date, because you can't employ somebody without work authorization. So you would expect that employee to get a new work document and present it to you on or before that previous employee's document expired. Yeah, so that's a long-winded answer, but a very good question, because re-verification of temporary work authorization is a critical step to I-9 compliance.
Yeah, perfect. Another question for James. This is kind of an interesting question related to the pandemic and everything we're living right now. So thoughts about what an employer should do if employees hired during pandemic using DHS flexibility to postpone in-person verification, but's terminated before the in-person verification is completed. If it comes up in an ICE audit, what would ICE expect to see?
That's a good question. I mean, I think clearly a good question. That's a good question for ICE. To some extent, we need to kind of find out what their response is. But I would say that if you can show, if this I-9 were to be audited, meaning you get a notice of inspection before you can purge this I-9, you're going to have to show the hire and termination dates for all your employees. And that implicit in that would be the understanding that this employee left before the physical and deferred physical and document inspection follow-up was required. And in theory, you wouldn't have to do anything. But I mean, it wouldn't hurt to put a little note, hey, this employee was terminated before we could do the physical inspection. That would be a little extra assurance that at least you'll be pointing ICE in the right direction for how they can understand and evaluate the cyanide by guiding them a little bit, and they might appreciate that. But as far as I know, ICE has not made any requirements that employers have to do anything specifically for this use case. But a great question, and one that I will feed up through our USCIS liaison. We have a point of contact at USCIS for such questions, and we'll ask this on your behalf and see if we can share the answer with you.
Yeah, I wish we had another like.
I know, right? We need to do this again, Ben. There's one pro tip I want to mention that I think that it's so important that I know we're at time, but let me just cover it real quick. And that is the 72-hour notice. So 72 hours is by law the amount of time that an employer gets to respond to an ICE audit. However, there's nothing in the rules that says ICE won't grant an extension if you ask. And in fact, most of the time we see that ICE will honor a reasonable extension for a request to get more time. So one thing to consider is if you do nothing else, at least remember that, hey, if I get the notice and I'm not prepared and I don't know who to talk to, you could at least ask for more time and just be truthful with the ICE and say, hey, look, I need more time because I gotta line up all the people to get this work done. And there's no guarantee that they'll honor that request, but there's no harm in asking. And again, most of the time, in fact, I think there maybe is one exception that I can think of where when our customers who've asked for extensions have been granted, 2-3 days and sometimes longer, depending on the circumstances. So keep that.
Well, Brian, I know we're at the end of our time, and I know we've all got busy schedules and calendars. I want to thank our audience, everyone for attending, of course, for Mitratech as a partner of Verified First. We're super excited because we did skip over the video of how easy it is really to request 99 with Verified First. So we'll share that video post-webinar. And then there's enough questions in our question queue. I think maybe my team here at Verified First, we can start creating kind of an FAQ and try to respond to your questions because there's quite a few. And if one has a question, it's likely everyone has a question. So Brian, I thank you for your time today. I know just before we wrap up, I want to turn the time over to our ghost voice, whatever you want, and talk about Sherman HRCI credits, and then invite everyone. Our next HR at the table is coming up just next week, I think. Yeah, I think it's the 17th, with the NFL head of HR talent engagement at the National Football League. So looking forward to that. And Brian, thank you again so much for your time. Your contact info of Mitratech's on the screen, and of course, Verified First contact info. Again, thank you, everyone. Have a good day, and back to our ghost voice.
Thanks,
All
Ben.
right. Thank you, guys. I'd like to give a big thank you to our hosts, Ben Cornett and Brian Fancher, for having this great and relevant discussion. We'd love to hear what you thought about our webinar today, so make sure to leave us some feedback. For our live attendees, stick around for just a little bit longer for our post-webinar survey to redeem one SHRM or HRCI credit. For any on-demand listeners, check your email for instructions on how to redeem your credit. Also available in the email will be a PDF of the 5 steps to prepare for the inevitable I-9 audit. So keep an eye out for all of that info. We'll be sending out the webinar on demand in case you want to use this for reference or send it to a colleague. Stay tuned for some more upcoming webinars, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for your time.